was a time when you couldn't escape them. They poured out of car windows on summer highways, rattled through tinny speakers at high school gyms, drifted across backyards at dusk. These weren't background music. They were the sound of a generation figuring out who it was, loud, restless, and unwilling to wait. Most younger listeners today have never heard them, not because they weren't good, because time moves fast, and popular memory is brutal in what it keeps and what it buries. These were no-one hits, chart toppers, songs that millions of Americans knew word for word, and they've been slowly disappearing from the cultural conversation ever since. That's the story worth telling. Not just what these songs were, but what they meant, who made them, and why they still matter to anyone paying attention. Number 1. California Dreamin', the Mamas and the Papas. It was the winter of 1963, and John and Michelle Phillips were freezing in a New York City apartment with no real plan and no real money. Outside, the streets were gray and bitter. Michelle started dreaming out loud about California, the warmth, the light, the feeling that something better existed somewhere else. John picked up a guitar. The rest happened fast. That longing, raw, specific, almost embarrassing in its honesty, became the engine of the song. California Dreamin' wasn't a celebration. It was a wound dressed up as a melody. The harmonies were lush, yes. The flute solo was haunting, yes. But underneath all that beauty sat something closer to desperation. A prayer from people who weren't sure the thing they wanted was even real. The record arrived in 1965 and hit listeners like cold water. Radio stations couldn't stop playing it. Audiences couldn't stop singing it. And somehow, decades later, it still shows up in films and documentaries whenever a director needs to signal, this is what longing sounds like. Before the record even fades in, something in the arrangement signals that this song will not let you go easily. The flute rises, the harmonies stack, and then the voice arrives, carrying a weight that no studio trick could manufacture.
He knows I'm gonna stay.
That single line lands differently every time. Not defiance, not peace. Something in between the complicated stillness of someone who has stopped running and isn't sure whether that's surrender or wisdom. The Mamas and the Papas never needed to explain it. They just sang it, and listeners filled in everything else themselves. Number 2. Happy Together, the Turtles. Several artists passed on this song, passed on it, heard the demo, shrugged, and moved on. They didn't hear what was buried inside those chords, something so purely, almost recklessly optimistic that it bordered on defiant. The Turtles heard it. They recorded it. And in 1967, Happy Together climbed straight to the top of the charts and knocked the Beatles out of the know. One spot. Think about what that means for a moment. A song nobody wanted, a song that was rejected, shelved, and nearly forgotten, dethroned the most dominant band on the planet, not through gimmick, not through controversy, through sheer, uncut joy. The melody was impossible to shake. The chorus hit like sunlight through a window on a cold morning, and the message was as simple as music ever gets. Two people, happy, together, against whatever the world decided to throw at them. The artists who passed on it never publicly explained their decision. They didn't need to. The chart numbers said everything. What the song captured wasn't just romance. It was a refusal to be cynical. In a decade torn apart by war, assassination, and social fracture, Happy Together chose a different register entirely. Whether that was naive or heroic depends on who you ask. The song didn't care. It just kept playing. Right from the opening notes, something shifts in the room. The tempo pulls forward, the melody locks in, and suddenly, against every expectation, you hear it.
What's your name? Who's your daddy? Who's your daddy?
The lyric lands with a grin built into it, playful, a little cheeky, completely alive. It's the sound of music that knows exactly what it's doing, and what it's doing is making you feel better about being alive. That was the whole point, and it worked every time. Number 3. Time of the Season, the Zombies. The Zombies had already broken up when this song became a hit. Let that settle in for a second. The band was gone. The members had moved on. And then, Somewhere in 1968, Time of the Season started climbing the charts, pulling a disbanded group back into the spotlight whether they were ready or not. The song had been recorded for the album Odyssey and Oracle in 1967, a record that barely registered on release. No major label push, no radio support. Then word spread, the way word used to spread slowly, person to person, someone handing a friend a record and saying, "You need to hear this." What made it different was the texture, the hypnotic, almost sensual groove, the jazzy rhythm section, Rod Argent's keyboard work, cool and precise, and Colin Blunstone's voice fragile and certain at the same time, like he knew something you didn't and wasn't sure whether to tell you. The song created an atmosphere that felt unlike anything else on the radio in 1968. Mystery dressed up as a pop record, and right at its center, a question that never quite resolved.
Time of the season for love.
4 words, and somehow they carried everything: desire, uncertainty, the specific electricity of a moment that might not last. Listeners couldn't place exactly why the song felt so urgent. That was the genius. You didn't need to understand it. You just needed to feel it. And you did. Number 4. Summer in the City, The Lovin' Spoonful. Every summer song before 1966 sold you the same fantasy. Beaches, sunsets, freedom from everything. The Lovin' Spoonful looked at that formula and burned it down. Summer in the City didn't offer escape. It offered the truth: concrete baking under August heat, crowds pressing in from every direction, the specific misery of a city that refuses to cool down after dark. John Sebastian wrote the song with his brother Mark and bandmate Steve Boone. They weren't romanticizing summer, they were documenting it. The production choices reflected that: pneumatic drills embedded in the track, car horns punctuating the rhythm, a keyboard line that pounded like pavement absorbing heat. Radio stations weren't sure what to do with it. Nothing about the song was comfortable, but it was honest in a way most pop records in 1966 refused to be, and listeners recognized that immediately. The song debuted and went straight to No. 1. The lyrics didn't dress anything up. They placed you directly on the sidewalk, in the thick of it, with no relief in sight.
People looking half dead, walking on the sidewalk harder than a match head.
Then the night shift kicks in. The contrast is almost violent. The heat stays, but the energy changes. The city doesn't stop, it just transforms. And that tension, the relentlessness of it, is what made Summer in the City feel less like a pop song and more like a short film. You didn't just hear it, you felt the asphalt through your shoes.
Summer in the city, in the summer in the city.
Simple, repetitive, inescapable, like the season itself. Number 5. He Ain't Heavy, He's My Brother, The Hollies. Almost no one knew it at the time, but the piano on this record was played by a young session musician named Elton John. He wasn't famous yet. He was just a hired hand in a London studio in 1969, sitting down at the keys and doing his job. What he helped create that afternoon would outlast almost everything else recorded that year. The Hollies built the song around a phrase that came from a boys' home in the American Midwest, the idea that a brother's weight is never a burden because love absorbs it. The message was simple, direct, the kind of thing that could have turned sentimental and hollow in the wrong hands. It didn't, because the execution matched the ambition. Alan Clark's vocal performance carried genuine weight, not performance, not artifice, but something that sounded like a man who actually believed the words he was singing. Listeners felt the difference. The record climbed steadily. It didn't explode, it accumulated. Word of mouth, repeated plays, people sharing it with people who needed to hear it. And then it just stayed. In the culture, in the memory, in the specific way that certain songs attach themselves to human experience and refuse to let go. The song moved people before anyone could explain why. And the reason sits right there in the lyric itself, plain, unhurried, completely certain.
Long, long road.
No metaphor, no ornament, just the thing itself, stated cleanly. And somehow that plainness hit harder than any clever lyric could have. Elton John's piano swells underneath it. The harmonies rise, and for 3 minutes, The idea that caring for someone else is never a burden feels less like a sentiment and more like a fact. Number 6. Cherish the Association. Terry Kirkman wrote this song in about 20 minutes. That's the part nobody mentions. The vulnerability that listeners spent decades connecting with, the longing, the restraint, the ache of loving someone you can't quite reach, came out of him in a single sitting, almost involuntarily. Some songs arrive that way. You don't write them so much as get out of the way. The Association recorded Cherish in 1966, and the production matched the writing, nothing overdone, nothing pushed past what the song needed. The harmonies were layered but not showy. The melody was gentle enough to feel intimate, strong enough to stick. Radio didn't need to work to sell it. People just kept requesting it. What the song tapped into was specific, unrequited love, but without bitterness. The narrator isn't angry. He isn't performing sadness. He's just holding the feeling steady, unresolved, real. That distinction mattered. Listeners who had ever felt that particular kind of longing recognized it immediately. The song climbed to No. 1. But the chart position was almost beside the point. What Cherish did was create a space where the feeling itself could breathe, and the lyric delivered it without flinching.
I could say I need you, but then you'd realize.
The line sits there quietly, carrying everything the narrator can't quite say outright. Not accusation, not pleading. Just the bare fact of it, offered up and left hanging. That restraint was the whole point. And decades later, fans still describe the song as the closest thing to having a private feeling made public without warning. The shift in the lyric is almost architectural, a door opening onto something the song has been building toward without announcing it. The Association understood that the most powerful moments in a love song aren't the declarations. They're the instants just before the declaration, when everything is still possible and nothing has been ruined yet. Number 7. Aquarius, Let the Sun Shine. In the Fifth Dimension. The song began as 2 separate pieces inside a Broadway musical called Hair, a show so controversial in 1968 that cities tried to ban it, parents protested outside theaters, and the cast performed certain scenes in defiance of local law. When the Fifth Dimension recorded Aquarius and Let the Sun Shine In as a medley, they weren't just covering show tunes. They were carrying the entire cultural argument of the late 60s into AM radio. The gamble paid off in a way nobody had quite anticipated. The record went to No. 1 inch 1,969 and stayed there for 6 weeks. It sold over 1 million copies. It won the Grammy for Record of the Year. And it did all of this not by softening the original material but by amplifying it, the gospel influence, the sheer size of the vocal arrangement, the feeling that something larger than a pop song was happening. Part of what made it work was the contradiction sitting at its center. The opening section, Aquarius, floated on melody, almost celestial in its delivery. Then, Let the Sun Shine In arrived and tore the roof off. The shift was jarring on purpose. It mirrored the era itself, people reaching for transcendence while the ground kept moving beneath them. The performance was electrifying. You could hear the conviction in it, not entertainment, but belief. And that came through clearly in every note. The words landed like a manifesto disguised as a melody. In 1969, after King, after Kennedy, after Chicago, after Vietnam, the idea that harmony and understanding might be possible felt both naive and desperately necessary. The Fifth Dimension didn't argue the point. They sang it and left the question open. Number 8. Turn, 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 The Birds. Pete Seeger took almost all of his lyrics directly from the book of Ecclesiastes, words written somewhere between the 4th and 2nd century BCE. He changed very little, added a melody, added a chorus, added the title. When the Birds recorded it in 1965, they were essentially delivering ancient scripture to teenagers through a Rickenbacker 12-string guitar. The fact that it worked is one of the more remarkable things in pop music history. The song arrived at a precise moment, America in 1965 was accelerating into conflict. Civil rights marches met with fire hoses, Vietnam casualties climbing, campuses beginning to simmer. The message that everything has its season, that even war eventually gives way to peace, wasn't political commentary. It was older than politics. And that depth gave it a weight that most protest songs couldn't match. The Byrds delivered it with a lightness that didn't undercut the gravity jangling, almost sun-drenched, the production creating a kind of cognitive dissonance with the weight of the words. That tension was the point. You couldn't hold the melody and the meaning at the same time without feeling something shift inside you. The lyric laid it out without ornamentation, without argument, just the ancient rhythm of things as they are. The sentence doesn't need to finish. The pattern is already established. 3,000 years of human observation, distilled into a pop record, played on the radio between car commercials and weather forecasts. That incongruity wasn't a weakness. It was exactly where the song needed to live. Number 9. Georgie Girl, The Seekers. Tom Springfield wrote the song for a 1966 British film of the same name, a comedy drama about a young woman in London trying to figure out who she was in a world that kept trying to define her for her. The Seekers recorded it as the title track. It won an Academy Award nomination. It went to No. 2 on the charts in both the UK and the US, and then, gradually, it faded. That's the part that deserves attention. Not the rise, the disappearance. Georgie Girl was everywhere in 1966 and 1967. Judith Durham's voice on that record was unmistakable, warm, clear, carrying the optimism of the song without tipping it into saccharine. Audiences responded with genuine affection, and then musical history moved on, the way it always does, and the song got left behind. It didn't get left behind because it was lesser. It got left behind because the late 1960s moved fast and hard toward darker, heavier sounds, and Georgie Girl, with its sweetness intact, didn't fit the new register. But sweetness isn't weakness, and the song deserved better than the cultural amnesia it received. The melody catches you off guard when you hear it again, the way something forgotten feels both strange and immediately familiar.
Georgie girl, swinging down the street so fast.
The lyric bounced. It moved. It contained something the culture increasingly didn't want to make room for. Uncomplicated delight. Not naive delight, the film itself was complicated, honest about loneliness and ambiguity. But the song found a brightness inside the complications and offered it without apology.
Shed those dowdy feathers and fly out over the
The promise in that line cuts through whatever distance time has put between that record and the present. Someone reaching past the armor. Someone insisting there's something worth finding underneath. Not every song from the 1960s needed to be an argument. Some of them just needed to be kind. Number 10. Monday, Monday, The Mamas and the Papas. Behind the scenes, the Mamas and the Papas were coming apart. John and Michelle Phillips were dealing with the strain their complicated personal lives put on the band's chemistry. Denny Doherty and Cass Elliot were navigating their own tensions. The four-person arrangement that produced those harmonies was held together by talent and friction in nearly equal measure. And somehow, out of that friction, came Monday, Monday, released in 1966, and shot straight to no one. The harmonies on the record were some of the finest the group ever recorded. Four voices finding each other with a precision that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with craft. The song was about the specific misery of Mondays, which meant it was about the specific misery of returning to reality after something good. Everyone understood it. Nobody needed it explained. The production was immaculate, spare enough to let the voices carry, structured enough to hold them in place. Lou Adler in the studio, the group in the room, something clicking that doesn't always click and can't always be manufactured. The result was a song that felt both effortless and essential. The feeling in that song is impossible to separate from the voices delivering it. Four people who couldn't always agree on anything, agreeing completely for 3 minutes.
Monday, Monday, how could you leave?
The line hits because everyone has felt it, that specific betrayal of a day that always promises a fresh start, and rarely delivers one. The Mamas and the Papas didn't write a protest song or a love song or a peace anthem. They wrote something more modest and more durable. A song about the ordinary disappointment of Tuesday morning disguised as a Monday complaint. That modesty was its own kind of ambition, and it worked. These 10 songs didn't all survive the decades equally. Some became permanent fixtures in the cultural landscape. Others faded so completely that younger generations would need a map to find them. But each one in its moment, in its context, said something true about what it meant to be alive in America in the 1960s. Not the mythology of the decade, not the curated nostalgia, the actual texture of it, the longing, the joy, the grief, the stubborn insistence that beauty was worth making even when everything else was falling apart. The songs that endure are the ones that told the truth. And the ones that disappeared? They told it too. Nobody was listening closely enough.